Turning in your Bibles back to Deuteronomy chapter 29, please. Deuteronomy 29. You can get your Bible, you can get your tablet or your cell phone, whatever you're using to be in the Word of God this morning. Please turn to Deuteronomy 29. Good to see our number climbing back up. The building's been kind of empty for the past few weeks, understandably so, but we're glad to see more faces. I think we have about half of our number here this morning is visiting with us, and that's great. We're glad to have that. I don't really mean 50%, but we do have a lot of visitors. Thank you for being here. If you have not already received it, you will, before you leave, receive an avalanche of smiles and handshakes and questions. And that's simply not to intrude or to make you uncomfortable, but we want to get to know you, and we would like to get to know you better and make a friendship with you. And so thank you for being here today. And I will offer to you, because I know I'm not going to get to have a chance to speak to each one of you individually, but we're interested in your soul and your spiritual well-being. And if we can study the Bible with you or anything that we can do to help you spiritually, please let us know. We want to do that. We want to serve however we can. Deuteronomy chapter 29, let's begin reading at verse 2. Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, "You have seen all that the Lord did before your eyes in the land of Egypt to Pharaoh and to his servants and all his land, the great trials which your eyes have seen, those great signs and wonders. Yet to this day the Lord has not given you a heart to know, nor eyes to see, nor ears to hear." Moses says, you have seen all the things that Pharaoh had happened to him. You saw those 10 plagues. You saw God part the Red Sea. You saw all of these things, and yet to this day, you can't see it. Now, we need to talk a little bit about history here and see what's going on. Moses says, you have seen what God did in Egypt. But remember the context of the book of Deuteronomy. When the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt, they became faithless in the wilderness. They didn't put their trust in God, and so God made them wander in the wilderness for a period of 40 years. And all of the people who were aged 20 and up died in the wilderness in that 40-year period. And the people that Moses is talking to in the book of Deuteronomy are all of those people aged 20 and below who survived. So yes, many of them did truly see what happened in Egypt. Not all of them. Many of them would have been too young to have seen it. Many of them would have been born in the wilderness. But many of them did see the things that happened in the land of Egypt. They saw the miracles. They saw God parting the Red Sea and so forth. And their faith should be in Jehovah God. And Moses is saying, don't make the same mistake that the previous generations made. You make sure that you grasp the significance of all of this. The generation 20 and above, the 2 generations who came out of Egypt, God brought them to Sinai. He made a covenant with them. They missed the significance. They missed the importance. Because when the time came to put their faith to the test, it wasn't there. Don't make the same mistake, Moses says. But what interests me about this text is that Moses says, you've seen these things with your eyes, and yet you haven't really seen. You haven't seen the significance. You haven't seen the power that lies behind what you have seen. There are spiritually significant things that you're missing. This text I'm using to introduce a lesson that one of our shepherds asked me to preach some time back, and I'm finally getting around to it. One of our elders said, Ben, I'd like you to do a lesson that talks about daily events, things that we see in our lives or in the lives of other people every day, commonplace events and activities, but underscore the spiritual application that comes from it. Because if we're not looking for that, it's really easy to miss. And this shepherd particularly had an emphasis on parents and children. Talking to our children or our grandchildren about spiritually significant events and drawing those applications from things that we see every day of our lives. And so I want to start this morning by giving you some examples of everyday events and activities that happen that if we will be perceptive and if we will just stretch it a little bit, we can find a spiritual application to make. So I've got 4 of them that I want to go through with you very quickly. The first one happened to us about a month ago. 2 of these are from personal experience. 2 of them are not. About a month ago, when I was preaching in a meeting in Alabama, I think it was Monday night of the meeting, we were driving from Athens, Alabama to Huntsville, Alabama, which is about a 25 or 30-minute drive. And we're going down the interstate heading toward Huntsville so we can, the meeting is in Huntsville, and we're going to have dinner with a family before services that night, and then we'll go to worship together for the meeting. And as we're driving down the interstate, we noticed that if you looked out the car on the left side, it was bright and sunny outside. But if you looked out the vehicle on the right side, it was dark and very gloomy. There were rain clouds that were gathering. It was very ominous. And so as I'm driving, kids don't do this while you're driving, but as I was driving, I rolled down the window and I kind of did this, going down the interstate at 70 miles an hour. Wasn't very smart, but this is basically what I saw. This is what we saw as we were driving down the road. Now, no, this is not the picture. This is not what we saw, okay? But this is the closest thing that I could find on the internet to what we saw. This is a shelf cloud, I think. Somebody's going to come prove me wrong after services. I think this is called a shelf cloud. And basically what you see here is where the rain clouds have gathered, but they're meeting the sun. We're seeing the limits of the rain cloud here. And that boundary where the storm clouds meet the sunshine. As we were driving, it was just the most stark contrast that you could see. And our children noticed that. They said, Daddy, Mommy, look outside. Look at the sky. This is incredible. And sure enough, it was. And as we were looking at this, I was reminded of a passage in 1 John chapter 1. Now, I quoted the passage to them as I was driving. I didn't get out my Bible and turn to it and read it. But this is the passage that I quoted to the children. 1 John chapter 1 and verse 5. This is the message we have heard from him and announced to you, that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. Now, can you see where I'm going with this? We were talking with the kids in the car, driving down the road, about how God is like the sunshine. God is light. And in him, there are no rain clouds. In him, there is no darkness. And I said, girls, just as you see the contrast between the light and the dark in the sky, that's exactly what the contrast between spiritual light and spiritual darkness is like. God has no darkness in him. He is light. He is glory. He is majesty, but he is goodness. And the children understood the point being made because they had a great visual given to us by God. What do you see in this picture? Now, let me pause and just observe this because maybe you probably can't tell it where you are. But this is one of the most photoshopped images I've ever seen. All right. This is not a real picture. Okay. Somebody is doing what he can do with what he's got. But you can picture this happening, right? What you have in this picture is a hungry lion chasing a terrified zebra. Does that ever happen? Happens every day, right? This is just a picture of nature at work. This is the food chain. Nothing to see here, right? This is just a common, regular, everyday activity. Hungry lion chasing his food. What else do you see in this picture besides the little poor little small zebra down here? You see all these up here, right? And you know, they're not helping. They're just standing there watching. Good luck. But when you look at this picture, you don't see anything spiritual, right? Or do you? Somebody did. Now what's the application? You know, you hear people say, yeah, I'm a Christian, but I don't go to church. I'm a Christian, but I don't need the church. Really? How's that working out for this zebra? Notice the lion is not attacking the group. Something about strength in numbers, right? And so someone saw this picture of a regular, normal, everyday activity and said, I think there's a spiritual application to make here. And there is. You remember 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8? 1 Peter 5 and verse 8 says, be of sober spirit, be on the alert. For your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. Let's not make it easy for him to find that someone. Let's not be that someone because we have said we don't need to be with the group. How about this picture? Now, I don't know anything about this picture. I just pulled this off of the internet, but I'm going to use this picture and say that this is a man and woman who have adopted a child. That's how I'm going to use the picture. I don't actually know that that's what it is, but that's what it is for me. Adoption. Some of you are adopted. Some of you have adopted. I suspect most of us know someone who has adopted. Adoptions, thank God, happen every day. And it is a wonderful thing. It's a beautiful thing. To have two people who have decided to take in a child who needs a home with loving parents, that is an amazing thing that is happening. And it happens in our world all the time. And yet, there's a spiritual application to this, right? You know, the New Testament says that Christians have been adopted into God's family. Let me show you a couple of passages. Look at Ephesians chapter 1. Ephesians chapter 1. Look with me at verse 5. Ephesians 1 and verse 5. In love, he predestined us to adoption as sons through Jesus Christ to himself, according to the kind intention of his will. Because God's will is kind and benevolent and loving, he has made it possible through his son to adopt more sons and daughters. But God has made it possible to expand and enlarge his family through the means of adoption. And he's done that through Christ. Flip back a couple of pages to Galatians chapter 4. Galatians 4 is an interesting text. There's a contrast here between those who are slaves and those who are sons. Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4 says, when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law, so that he might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. We can become children of God. And we do that through this process of adoption. I know we also do it, the New Testament says, through the process of a new birth. So we're both born into God's family and adopted into God's family. These are not intended to be literal things. These are metaphors to help us grasp a concept, that we are in the family of God. And Paul says that we've been adopted. And now he says in verse 6 that there are some consequences that come from that. Because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Therefore, you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. We have the opportunity, because we are children of God. We are his sons. We can cry out to him. We can have an intimate relationship with him. We can pray to him and know that he will hear us, that he will work things out for our benefit and for our blessing. And because we are sons, not slaves, we're not the servants, we're not outcasts, but because we are sons, we are heirs and beneficiaries of all that God has in store for us. You ever hear of someone adopting a child? What a great opportunity to talk about how we've been adopted into the family of God. At camp this year, I was talking with some of the children, and the subject of adoption came up. I joined the conversation kind of late, and so I'm not sure how the conversation naturally came about, but I'm guessing one of the children was adopted. And I said, I'm adopted too. Are you serious, Mr. Ben? You were adopted? I sure was. I was adopted when I was 18 years old. What? You were adopted when you were 18 years old? I said, yes, I sure was. And of course, I explained, I was adopted into the family of God when I became a Christian. Some of you are maybe having a little bit of a heart attack a moment ago when I said I was adopted, because you said, Ben, aren't your mother and father here in this room right now? And yes, they are. But you see, we've all been adopted if we belong to Jesus Christ. Now, this next picture and this last one is going to take a little more time to develop, okay? So I need to work this one a little bit slower and a little bit more. We've all played this, right? Candyland. Last week, now I told you that two of these were from personal experience, so here's the second one. Last week, one of my children, I won't say her name because I don't want to embarrass her. One of my children asked a very profound question. We had breakfast that morning, and I was getting ready to come to the office. And we prayed together before I left, and then I got in the car and I began driving to work. I haven't been away from the house 1 minute. And I get a text from Stacy, and she says, this child just asked, how do I know that God is real? I mean, when we pray, how do I know that someone actually hears me? If you know the ages of my children, you'll understand that's not exactly the question I was expecting. And so as I'm driving down the road, giving some thought to how am I going to answer this question at an appropriate level for the child, I thought about Candyland. And I know you're thinking, where in the world is he going with this? Well, let me explain. So I came home that day, that evening, we all had supper together. And after supper, I took this child and we sat down at the table together. And I said, go get Candyland. Let's play. So she went over and she got the box. We came out. We set up the game. And I said, I'm going to tell you something really cool about this game. You see this board? You see how colorful it is? And you see the way that these pictures line up and everything, all these words and all of that. I said, let me tell you where this board came from. Long time ago, there was an art studio, and in this art studio was a table with a bunch of paint. All kinds of paint colors were sitting on this table in the art studio. And you know what? Somebody came into the art studio and they bumped into the table, they knocked it over, and paint spilled everywhere. And after the mess was cleaned up, would you believe it? This picture was created when all of that paint spilled. Can you believe that? She looked at me and she said, Daddy, that's crazy. You're exactly right. That is crazy. So I inquired a little further. When you look at this board, what do you see? And she said, well, I see a track with squares and I see words and pictures. And I said, yeah, and what does that tell you? And you see, we kind of developed the conversation a little bit. And finally, she came to the conclusion, someone designed this board. Exactly. It didn't just happen. Application. Let's walk outside. Look at the trees. Look at the sky. Look at the mountains and the water and the deer and the fish. Look at the dogs. Look at the cats. Look at all the things that we see in nature. Look at the stars and the planets. It didn't just happen by spilling paint in the art studio. How do you know there's a God? Look at all the design in the world. It didn't just happen. So let's play the game. You start, I said. So she takes the card, and it's got that colored square on it, and she moves her piece to green or red or whatever it was. Well, then I picked up my card. And whatever color it had on it, let's just say it was blue. You start down here at the bottom with these two happy-looking children. Let's just say my square was blue, which means I'm supposed to move right here to the first blue square. Well, I picked up my piece, and I moved it up here. I jumped 2/3 of the way down the board. And she said, hey, wait a minute. You can't do that. Why not? I can do whatever I want to do, I said. No, you can't. You have to play by the rules. What rules? What do you mean rules? We're just making this up as we go. I can play the game however I want to. And she was really crying foul at this point. That's not how you play the game. You have to do it the way the game says to be played. And I said, okay, now wait a minute. So you're telling me that there are rules that have to be obeyed? There are rules that have to be followed in order for us to play the game in a fair and equitable way? And she said, yes, that's right. You have to follow the rules. Where did the rules come from? I asked. Well, I guess they came from the people who designed the game. Exactly. And I said, you know, all of us on this earth, we have an instinctive understanding of things that are right and things that are wrong. We have a conscience that there are some things that we just know instinctively are wrong and should not be done. But then there are other things that we just naturally know are right and ought to be done. Where does that come from? I asked. I guess it comes from God. Exactly right. God gave us rules. And some of those rules we just naturally know and understand. But all of God's rules and laws are contained in this book right here. So can I show you some passages that support these two applications that I made from Candyland? Let's start in the book of Job. I'm going to Job chapter 12. Job chapter 12. Remember, application number 1. When you see a board game, there was a designer. Job chapter 12. Look with me at verse 7. Job says, Job 12, verse 7, "But now ask the beasts and let them teach you, and the birds of the heavens and let them tell you. Or speak to the earth and let it teach you, and let the fish of the sea declare to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this, in whose hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind?" You see what Job says? He says, let's go play Candyland. Job says, look at the earth. Look at the animals. Look at the design of everything. Ask them. Not literally, of course, but his point is you can just look at this world and know that someone made this. In Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, the Apostle Paul said that God's invisible attributes, his power and his divinity, are clearly seen by the things which he made. We can look outside and know someone made this, but not just any someone. Someone who is powerful and divine has made all of this. Now look at Psalm 19, because Psalm 19 brings together both Candyland applications. Psalm 19. And what I want to show you in this psalm is that God has two books. Two books that he uses to show that he exists and to show us what he wants. The first book is the book of God's works, the things that he has created. Psalm 19 and verse 1, "The heavens are telling of the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of his hands." The creation that God has made is telling and declaring about God's greatness and his power. And verses 1 through 6 of Psalm 19 talk about this creation which God has made, the works that he has done that display his power. But God's second book is the book of his words. And in verse 7, Psalm 19 says, "The law of the Lord is perfect, restoring the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes." The judgments is mentioned in the next verse. The book of God's words also affirms his existence and what he wants for us. Two significant points about God's existence drawn from a simple child's board game. Now, I'm not going to ask you to show by a raising of your hands, but I'd be curious to know how many of you have ever thought about Candyland like this. And now, God bless each one of you. Every time you play Candyland for the rest of your lives, you're going to think about this sermon. So, let me draw some applications of what I'm suggesting to you this morning. And parents and grandparents, I'm particularly emphasizing these things to you. Number one, spiritual lessons are everywhere. We just have to be perceptive enough to look for them. They're everywhere. I've just given you 4 examples this morning of very simple things that we could look to and draw spiritual applications from. But if you sat down and you thought about this for even just a few moments, you could easily come up with a lengthy list of spiritual applications drawn from everyday, commonplace events. Now, here's where I want to go with that. Go back to Deuteronomy, but I want to go to chapter 6. And I know you know this passage. You're already reciting it in your head. But I don't care. We're going to look at it anyways. Because this passage is so critically important to what I'm suggesting to you this morning. In Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 6, Moses says, "These words which I command you today shall be on your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. And you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontals on your forehead. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." Talk to your children about spiritual things. Isn't that what Moses is saying there? And it's not something that we need to do just, every now and then, or maybe as we think about it, which only comes up once or 2 times a month, or every 3 months, or whatever it might be. When you stand up, when you sit down, when you go to sleep, when you wake up, talk to them about spiritual things. Now, you say, how can I do that? I mean, am I supposed to just be talking to my kids about the Bible 24 hours a day? Can I literally be expected to do that? No. But maybe you could do it by talking about some of these things like we've looked at this morning. And maybe when you're flipping through the Discovery Channel and you see that lion chasing down the zebra, or you see during Shark Week the shark eating some bleeding fish, you could talk about some things, couldn't you? There's a lot of directions you could go with something like that. You look at these everyday activities, and each one of these can be a teachable moment if we would see it. If we would look for that opportunity to draw a spiritual application from, then the opportunities to talk with our kids about spiritual things have increased exponentially. Spiritual applications are everywhere. Look for them. Secondly, talking to our kids about these things does not have to be complicated. I think sometimes we get this idea that if I'm going to talk to my kids about the Bible, I've got to do what Mr. Ben and Mr. Joe do, and I've got to put together a sermon with an outline, and it's going to take me hours and hours and hours to do this. And it doesn't have to be that way at all. It doesn't have to be complicated. I think there are 3 very simple things that we can do, very, very easy things that we can do to have spiritual conversations and worship in our home with our kids. And I've used this with you before, but you don't remember because it was like 5 years ago when I did it. Read the Bible. Pick a passage. It doesn't matter. Go through Proverbs. So much practical application in Proverbs. Go through the Sermon on the Mount. I've been going through the Sermon on the Mount with our kids for months now. Not every day, but all along, we pick up a section, we read it, and we talk about it. Pick up your Bible, read 1 chapter. You don't have to do any prep work at all. Have them read it. You read a little bit of it. Pick out 1 verse and discuss it. That'll take 10, 15 minutes. Simple. Very simple. Read. Pray with them. We join in a circle oftentimes. We all hold each other's hands and we go around and each child prays for one thing. That's it. I just ask them to pray for one thing. And then when it comes around to me, I finish it up. It takes 3 minutes. Sing. Read. pray, sing. We do this at night at bedtime. All of our kids are in a room together. I put Charlotte in her little toddler bed, and the other ones have a bunk bed set up. They all three use. I put Charlotte in her bed. I sit down at the foot of her bed, and I sing hymns. If the girls know it, they join in. If they don't, they listen to me do a solo. And in about 10 minutes, Charlotte drifts off to sleep. Read, pray, sing. Oh, but Ben, I can't sing. I have a terrible voice. So what? Doesn't matter. What will impress the children is not the beauty of your voice. What will impress them is that mommy and daddy are sitting in my bedroom singing. That's what they'll remember. You don't have to create 5-page outlines with handouts and questions. Pick a chapter, read it, pick one verse and talk about it. It's so easy. If you're spending more than 3 minutes in preparation, you're doing it wrong. We can do that every day. Lessons are everywhere. Talking to them doesn't have to be complicated. But thirdly, it does have to be a priority. Have you seen that graphic that we have on the slideshow during the announcements before services? There's one graphic that we've had up there for a long time. And it says, if we don't teach our kids to follow Christ, the world will teach them not to. You see, doesn't that impress upon us the fact that this should be a priority? Because our kids are receiving a lot of filth and junk in the world right now. And we need to take that bucket of their hearts and get all that junk and filth out. We need to clean it up. We need to wash it, put some soap in there and get some elbow grease in there. And then we need to fill it up with good stuff. And this is how we can do it. I hope that as we've thought about some of these things this morning, maybe your mind has gone to places and events and activities and things that happen in the world that there may be a spiritual application to that maybe you've never even seen before, but now you do. Try to find something today. I'm sure you can find more than one, but try to find something today. Nothing extraordinary, nothing unusual, but something that happens every day that you can draw a spiritual application from, and talk to your kids about it. Get them to open up and see where the conversation leads you. I appreciate your attention this morning. I meant what I said at the beginning about wanting to help, wanting to serve however we can. And maybe you have a spiritual need this morning, whether you need to come to Christ and be adopted into his family, or if you need to return to him so that you can be an heir and a participant of all the things that he has in store for you. We want to help you this morning, and we would invite you, please come down to the front right now as we sing together. You do me